I am joined today on our Filmmaker Showcase by director Michael Jahr. Michael, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing very well, John. Thanks for having me on.
Michael, one of the things I really enjoy about documentaries is I get to learn things as well as experience things that I was completely unaware of. And it really enriches me as well as enriches a larger community. And I hate to say, as someone from Wisconsin, I had no idea about the subject of the documentary that you're working on, and that is Joshua Glover. Can you tell us a little bit about this individual and why his story is so important, not just for Wisconsin, but for, frankly, the entire country?
Absolutely, John. And I will let you off the hook. I have talked to hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people about this story. And I would say maybe 1 or 2% of them have ever heard this story, even if they're from Milwaukee or Racine or Ripon. It's just a story that's been lost to memory. So that's why we're so enthusiastic about kind of reviving and retelling this story.
The events, which took place in the Wisconsin cities of Racine, Milwaukee, and Ripon in March 1854, were not premeditated. No one intended to light a fuse that would contribute to the fracturing of a nation. The story began with an unlikely protagonist. Joshua Glover, a fugitive slave living in Racine, had risked everything 2 years earlier to escape from a Missouri farm in pursuit of his God-given right to freedom. He made it safely to the north, worked at a Racine sawmill, and lived in a small cabin. From all accounts, he had established a good life, but he was a hunted man.
So Joshua Glover was working as a slave in St. Louis, Missouri in 1852. He worked on a farm owned by a guy named Benamy Garland. But at some point, in the spring of 1852, he mustered the courage, the incredible courage that it must have taken to escape. And he crossed over the river into Illinois and made his way about 400 miles to Racine, Wisconsin. And there he was embraced by the abolitionist community. He found a job working at a sawmill. He found a place to live. He must have been sort of an entrepreneurial individual because apparently he made some wooden crafts and so on that he would then go into town and sell, and apparently had a pretty thriving business. So for 2 years, for the first time in his life, he was able to enjoy the fruits of his labor. But Benamy Garland never stopped looking for him. He had a $200 reward for Joshua Glover. The slave catchers were dutiful in tracking him down, and by 1854, they had located him. So Benamy Garland comes up to Milwaukee, to the courthouse here, and says, "This is my property down here in Racine, Wisconsin." He got a warrant for Glover's arrest. He put together a posse. They went down on a cold March night. They went at night because they were a little nervous about the abolitionist community. They went at night, knocked on his door. Glover was playing cards with a couple of friends. And when the door opened, the posse, swept in. Glover, as anybody would, reacted, in shock and tried to defend himself. He was beaten. He was shackled. He was thrown into a wagon, the floor of a wagon, and carted for several hours on the frozen, bumpy roads back to Milwaukee. And once they got to Milwaukee, they threw him in a jail cell, and Glover had to, contemplate the thought of returning back to a life of bondage. But one of the fellow card players, one of his friends, had crawled out through the window when this all took place and alerted the abolitionist community in Racine that this had taken place. They held a big rally in the town square, the biggest rally that had ever taken place in the town square of Racine the following day. And they also sent a telegram up to a abolitionist newspaper editor named Sherman Booth up in Milwaukee. And Booth decides to get on his horse, Paul Revere style, and rides through the streets of Milwaukee, calling out for people to turn out on Joshua Glover's behalf. He said, "A man's liberty is at stake. Come down to the courthouse at 2 p.m." And they also put out flyers, and church bells were ringing, and it was quite the event, quite the civic event. 5,000 people turned out on a cold March Saturday in Wisconsin at the courthouse. And they initially set things up sort of as a meeting. They appointed a president, they elected committees, they passed resolutions basically calling for due process for Joshua Glover. They gave
Mhm.
speeches in English and in German because that was the population of Milwaukee. And but eventually, after several hours of that, they realized that officials who were kind of abiding by the Fugitive Slave Act had no intention of giving him any due process or setting him free. So they
Yeah.
switched tactics fairly dramatically. And if you know where the cathedral is across the street from Cathedral Square, it used to be Courthouse Square. The cathedral was being built at the time. And so they grabbed a wooden beam from the cathedral construction site and went over and said, this will make a fine key. And they used that to batter down the courthouse door. And they swept in, they overwhelmed the guards. They basically pried Joshua Glover out of his jail cell and then whisked him out into the courtyard where there was just this massive celebration. It was like he was a conquering hero. People were shaking his hands and cheering, and they put him on a carriage, which then took him down to Walker's Point, and then they switched to another carriage and took him off to Prairieville, which is today Waukesha.
Now, I have to stop you there for a second, Michael,
Sure.
because so often when we hear these stories about a mob battering down a courthouse or a jail cell door, it's followed with, one of the most horrible things that can happen to anyone, but certainly Black Americans during that time period, a lynching. And to hear this
Absolutely.
story of Wisconsinites, and as you say, some of them immigrants who battered down that door because they wanted to ensure that a human being enjoyed their inalienable rights that are in the Constitution
Hmm.
is an absolutely amazing story. I'm curious, I think a lot of folks don't understand Wisconsin's political history, the parties that it gave birth to, and how events like this eventually influenced the politics of the nation. Can you just talk a little bit about Wisconsin's political history and specifically what happened with Mr. Glover and how that may have affected what happened in the country about less than a decade or so later with the beginning of the Civil War?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how those ties are there. And even when I knew this story initially many years ago, I didn't realize that it was such a catalyst. The Joshua Glover's experience was such a catalyst for other events that had national impact.
In the weeks following his rescue, Glover was hidden in homes, attics, and barns along the Wisconsin Underground Railroad. He was eventually smuggled onto a ship in the Racine Harbor and taken to Canada, where he lived out the rest of his life in the freedom he so desperately sought. It is not known if Glover tracked the historic events in America that followed his escape.
But it was just 9 days after his rescue that another group of abolitionists gathered up in a schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. And they said, we have got to have a new party, a new political party in this country that's based on opposition to slavery. And
Mm,
those people who came out of that meeting called themselves Republicans. And really,
mm.
that was the first gathering of the what would become the Party of Lincoln anywhere in the country to identify that name and basically base their unity on the opposition to the expansion of slavery. There were following events in Jackson, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Madison, actually. But the very first gathering along those lines was right here in Ripon, Wisconsin, 9 days after Glover's arrest.
To me, that is absolutely remarkable. And that so many of us don't understand where the Republican Party started, why it was started, what it represented then, and shifts that happened between the Democrats and the Republicans long before today. We're talking back in the 1960s. But as with any parts of history, if we don't understand it and we don't know it, then all of us are ignorant to it. And as the saying goes, we repeat the same mistakes over and over again. The
Mm.
documentary that you want to put together sounds absolutely phenomenal. The challenge with anything is how does one put it together? How does one, particularly in the environment that we're in, where I just have to acknowledge that folks are very nervous about telling stories despite the fact that they're true, despite the fact that they're positive, despite the fact that they show the best of America. Folks are nervous about telling these kinds of stories. For you, as you look for partners to help you tell this amazing story, what are the challenges? And why is it so important that you look for people who are willing to both share their energy, but more importantly, truly invest in the story that you're telling?
Yeah, it really has been quite an interesting road. This is my first time as a full-time documentarian. My background's in communications and journalism, and I've done a lot of different things over the years, but really didn't know exactly what I was getting into when I started this. We've been very fortunate, though, to have the backing of some very high-profile people for Liberty at Stake. So the full name of the film is Liberty at Stake: The Joshua Glover Story. You can check out our website at LAS, Liberty at Stake, lasfilm.com or org. But yeah, so we started off by just kind of telling this story and seeing if we could raise some money. And we were this is at the end of 2023, and we were very fortunate to get some early donors, many individual donors, but also Associated Bank came on board very early on.
Wow.
And we put together a 12-minute mini documentary that we showed at the Miller Theater, the historic Miller Theater in downtown Milwaukee, during the Republican National Convention last July. So the thought was that we've got 50,000 people coming to us, and they're going to be just a few blocks away from Joshua Glover was arrested. From a marketing standpoint, what better opportunity than that? So, but it's not a partisan story at all. We were
Right.
really trying to steer away from that. What I love about this story is that it's so unifying. So in the mini documentary that we put together, it's about 12 minutes, and you can find it on our website. We had Rebecca Clayfish participating in that as a journalist, and she's a former Republican lieutenant governor of Wisconsin. But we also had Mayor Cavalier Johnson, and
Right.
we've got people we had Claiborne Benson from the Wisconsin Black History Museum, and Lucas Weber, an attorney who is with the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and could kind of speak to the legal battles that followed, because Joshua or Sherman Booth and some of the other rescuers were actually arrested after
Mm.
they participated in this. There were 6 years of battles between the federal courts and the state courts, and eventually the Wisconsin state court said that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional and would not be enforced in Wisconsin, and set these guys free. And we were the only state in the nation to do that. So again, Wisconsin just really took a principled stand. Um, but we've been very fortunate to have, Senator Ron Johnson and Governor Scott Walker and Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, and just a broad array of people kind of be backing us and supporting us and helping to promote this. We did a showing in the state capitol, and you have to have legislative sponsors in order to show, to have an event there. We had Our sponsors were Black and white, Republican and Democrat, male and female. There aren't many things that you get these days that can kind of bring that kind of a group together. So that's really a big part of why we love this story and feel that's so important in this kind of polarized political and cultural environment that we're in, to find stories that bring us together. You've said in the past, we're better together. And I think that's exactly what Liberty at Stake and the Joshua Glover story are about.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. And for people who just know any little bit about the politics in Wisconsin currently, if you can bring Cavalier Johnson and Ron Johnson together, that's pretty remarkable. And I mean that truly, not hitting on the square. I want to say to folks who are watching that if you go down towards the comments, we are going to have links to Michael's website, ways that you can participate, ways that you can help tell this story. If you're anywhere in this country and you're an individual, like Michael says, was looking for a way to bring people together, I think you're going to want to support this story. I would give a particular shout out to folks in Wisconsin. This is a story that shows us, and I mean Wisconsinites, at our best. And I've had the opportunity to travel the world. There are some amazing places, but there is no better place than Wisconsin, and our history in politics and what folks have done and how they have fought historically for what is right is so important. And Michael, I give you so much credit for not just trying to tell a documentary, because that's very hard, but to tell very specific stories about people, about doing the right thing, and why that is so important in history, and why doing the right thing, it does not go out of fashion. It really doesn't. The name of the film, Liberty at Stake: The Joshua Glover Story. This is a film that you're currently trying to put together. And again, for anyone who's watching the sound of our voice, please look in the comments, look in the description. We'll have links. And as you continue to develop this project, Michael, please feel free to check in with us so that we can give updates to individuals as well. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on this Filmmaker Spotlight. All the best with this film. It sounds absolutely phenomenal.
John, it's a privilege to be joining you on this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.